Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon to those joining us from Asia, and good morning to everyone in Europe. I'm Michael Lawrence of Asia House. Great to see you all here. So have quite a few people dialing in, but we're going to get underway now. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to China's digital transformation, shaping the global data landscape, a conference we're producing in partnership with CKGSB. China and the US are the primary actors, driving the global data landscape and shaping regional digital strategies. Navigating those different strategies represents a major challenge. The lack of standardized data regulations and the growing digital divide between the main players means that international businesses operate in an increasingly complex digital ecosystem, one feature of which is the relative lack of digital interoperability. Today, we will explore China's role in shaping the global data landscape. We'll be looking at how it's diverging from the US, and we'll examine what this means for business, the hurdles they face, and how they can overcome them. In a moment, we'll ask our keynote speaker, Rowan Kang, the Chief Operating Officer and Global Accounts Lead of Microsoft Greater China, to make the opening address. Rowan joins us today from Beijing. Rowan will be sharing with us his insights on China's digital transformation and its impact on international businesses operating in the country. We'll then hear from Sun Tian-Shu, visiting professor of information systems, director of the Center for Technology, Big Data and Digital Transformation at CKGSB. He will give us a presentation on digital transformation in China and also in the US, and share with us his observations on the key differences between the two and the unique path that China is taking. We'll then broaden out the discussion with a panel of three experts looking at issues including digital innovation as a driver of investment and consumer demand, digital trends and opportunities for the financial sector in China and in Asia, and also the impact of digital innovation in China and the US on international businesses and those operating in the Middle East and Africa. So a very broad range of issues we're going to be touching on there. We welcome your involvement in today's discussion. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please let me know by putting your virtual hand in the air or sending a message via the chat function. To be clear, today's event is on the record. We are on the record today, and we are recording the discussion. So let's get underway now, and it's my pleasure to invite Rowan Kang, the Chief Operating Officer and Global Accounts Lead of Microsoft Greater China, to make the opening address. Rowan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Michael, and I appreciate the opportunity to address the Asia House in partnership with CKGSB. I'm Rowan Kang. I'm what we call the Chief Operating Officer here in Microsoft Greater China, covering the China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan markets and region. So it has been an unprecedented couple of years, I think, in terms of acceleration of digital transformation due to COVID-19. And what we've seen is that for Microsoft, right, we are the first international global scale public cloud player to land our cloud compliantly and legally in China. We did that more than 8 years ago with the collaboration of the China cybersecurity and government regulators. And the model that we ultimately adopted using what's called an operating entity to run the data centers and host our cloud services in China, right, ultimately ended up being the model that every global player has had to go with in China. And so we've had a lot of experience working with digital interoperability across borders. And today I thought that I would share quickly sort of three things, right, because I've been asked to speak quite briefly. The first is the trends we're seeing in digital transformation, especially in the manufacturing and automotive industries, right? These are two of the big focus areas for China, the country, in terms of its overall industry strategy, but also for international players and for Microsoft here in the region. The second is to talk briefly about how we support multinational companies in China and how they succeed. And the third is talking about sustainability. This has become top of mind for sure within the top three priorities for virtually every company we talk to in China, right? Whether a local Chinese company or a multinational company operating here. In terms of digital transformation, I would say that the core of it comes from data, right? I mean, there's been a lot of discussion here in China because the government just passed the new data entry laws and exit laws in terms of what that means for different players in China. Regardless, that we can spend a lot of time talking about that, and I'm no lawyer, but I think that the key is for any entity, right, for any enterprise or any customer working in China, or frankly globally, data is at the heart of any digital transformation that they're going to drive. And the four things that typically we find enterprises all want to do differently, right, is first improving their customer engagement, right, in a data-based way. The second is better empowering their employees to work in a hybrid mode, especially in today's environment, right? In China, you never know when a portion of your workforce may be required to work from home or remotely. And so working in a hybrid environment where some people are in the factory or in the office and others are not is basically completely de rigueur here in China. The third region is around more efficient operations, right? I mean, nowadays, just about every company facing economic headwinds, both in the Greater China area, but globally, is looking for ways to do more with less, right? To improve their efficiency and to drive down their costs and to improve their operational, streamline their operations and improve their operational efficiency. The fourth region is probably where we see the most in terms of advancement, right? In terms of the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years. It used to be that a lot of MNCs came and said, hey, what I want to do is replicate what I have globally in a compliant and legal way in China. But more and more what we find is that people actually want to innovate in China, both for China, but also for their global markets, right? And so the fourth area of digital transformation that we find is really around transforming your own products and services. And so how that plays out in terms of both the future of manufacturing and the automotive industry, right? You can see in terms of manufacturing, it's about having agile, smart factories using technology like what we call the industrial metaverse, right? Having digital twins, having essentially a digital replica of your entire factory base such that you can make optimization and control them, right, in real time from the headquarters. And then, of course, creating much more resilient supply chains and sustainable supply chains, right? That's very important in manufacturing. In terms of automotive, right, we see very much that China is going to be the leading edge of the future of the automotive industry. It's the largest automotive market on earth for just about every player at this point, and almost all of them tell me that they're planning to electrify everything, right? And so by definition, it means that the car will be a digital vehicle, will be essentially a computer on wheels, right? A connected computer on wheels. It already is, but it's going to be even more intensely so in the future. And very interestingly, there's a host of ways that the Chinese government is looking to regulate and monitor the electric car, right? The digital car. And that's something that is top of mind very much for our automotive customers. Okay. I mentioned that Microsoft supports a lot of multinational companies here in China. So just to be clear, we support Chinese companies in China. We support Chinese companies taking their business overseas globally. But I think for today's audience, right, a large part of what we talk about is supporting multinational companies in China. And I think some of the things that we're very concerned about together with all the other multinational companies, right, is making sure that we manage to stay legal and compliant in the laws and regulations of any local market that we operate in, right? So this can be sometimes tricky because the regulations may not always be aligned, right? You may have some contradictory things in certain markets. And so as much as possible, we strive to help our customers reach some level of consistency, right? Whether they're operating in the European markets, in North America, in Japan, or in China. And so having sort of the world's largest enterprise public cloud in Azure and Microsoft 365 be the same consistent technology stack, the same level of compliance, both in China and outside of China, is very helpful to a lot of our MNC customers. An example of this is when GDPR came into effect in the EU a few years back, Microsoft made a commitment a long, long time ago, right? Even long before we were working with regulators in the EU, not only to be compliant in the EU itself, but Microsoft made a decision that we would simply be compliant with GDPR everywhere, right? In every possible country, all of our platforms, our technology, our products, our services, because we understand that MNC companies operate around the world in every country. And so there's no telling when a Chinese customer may decide they need to be compliant with GDPR. There's no, and for certain, if you're a European company, you have to be compliant with GDPR anyway, right? So this is the sort of thing that Microsoft works with a lot of times in terms of addressing the concerns of multinationals, is remaining legal and compliant in China with the cybersecurity law, the data protection law, the privacy laws, and then also, of course, having the same platform consistently applicable, right? The same application base, the same database, in terms of being able to port your applications and solutions globally to China and vice versa. That's very helpful to multinationals. And then the third thing, of course, is a trusted partner that you're used to working with, right, both globally and in China, I think is very helpful. I think going forward, talking about sustainability, the most important thing here is that it's become a core priority for virtually every customer we talk to, right? This is something that in every country we work in, and Microsoft is active in more than 190 countries. It's largely becoming by law or by regulation something that is required as opposed to something that's a nice to have. In China, for example, the so-called 3060 carbon emissions law or regulations or requirement came into effect. And overnight, right, every customer I talked to in China basically wanted to talk about sustainability and how to make it happen. Here, I wanted to briefly share Microsoft's own commitments, right, in terms of starting from the core, which is making sure that we contribute in a sustainable way. And then I'll talk about kind of what we do for customers. In terms of winning a sustainable future, the first thing is that Microsoft pledged to become carbon negative by 2030. And by this, we mean a couple of things. Carbon negative means that we will extract from the greater environment more carbon than we emit. So Microsoft is doing a lot to invest in things like carbon capture, in addition to making sure that all our data centers around the world run on 100% renewable energy by 2025. And then that all our office buildings as well, right, are committed to doing that. The nice thing is that one of the things we looked at is when we looked at our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, in the past year, Microsoft grew its business by 20% worldwide, but we decreased our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions by nearly 20%. So that's pretty good. Our scope 3, not as much in terms of our long range vendors and supply chain. That unfortunately grew in parallel to our own business growth. So we personally have work to do, right? But I do think that it's a level of Microsoft's commitment and transparency to that. In addition to carbon emissions, we pledged to be water positive by 2030 as well, meaning we would actually put back or purify more water in the natural environment that we use, because we leverage a lot of water, especially for our data centers, to cool them. That we pledged we would be zero waste by 2030, right? This is in terms of, for example, the production or manufacturing of our own Surface computers and PCs, as well as our Xbox consoles and whatnot, that we would be using essentially almost 100% recycled materials by then. And then finally, our pledge would be to build the planetary computer and to preserve endangered ecosystems that we operate in. Right? So this is sort of the scope of Microsoft's commitment to sustainability. And the other arguably even larger impact that we're hoping to have and to help people is in our customers is that address climate change is to take what we've learned and the technology that we use to drive our own sustainability efforts in ESG, to turn those into platforms and services that our customers, our enterprise customers and partners can leverage themselves in their own ESG efforts. Right. So Microsoft, for example, came out with what we call the Sustainability Cloud by Microsoft, which helps our customers start to measure and contain and lower their carbon emissions across their operations across scope 1, 2, and 3. Right. So this is an example of the kind of things that I think are high priority for our customers that we see in China, and that are always talked about in addition to the digital operating environment and all of the ways that digital technology is going to help build a sustainable future together for everybody. Okay. So that's just very briefly some of the things that are, I think, top of mind that we see in Microsoft in the region. And I believe we have a little bit of time, Michael, for some Q&A, right? So I'm happy to take some questions.
We do, Roy. I want to start, if you don't mind. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Yeah, please.
You mentioned a couple of things. I was struck by one of your comments is that you're cloud complies with every regulation in every jurisdiction, from GDPR to China and everything. Surely this is a constraint for some businesses operating in particular markets where they don't need to comply with a particular set of regulations. And secondly, are there any risks of conflict where regulations are so different that complying to both means that it's incredibly difficult to operate in either environment?
Yeah. So what we find is a couple of things. To your first question, if you are a legal business, generally speaking, you're okay complying with the regulations in the particular markets that you operate in. And so Microsoft typically, what we try to do is make sure that our cloud complies with the constraints of the legal requirements in each market without unduly affecting the operations, right, of the business operations of any customer on our cloud. The second piece to your question is, so the sort of side part of that is certain operators may not be as interested in remaining legally compliant. They may have a problem, but that's a different story, right? I think that the second part to your question is we work very hard with the government regulators in different markets when we run into issues where the regulations are contradictory, right? It does happen. But in general, we find that in the technology world, we strive for consistency, right? Because it makes it very difficult for different players if there are contradictory laws, right? And so this is an ongoing dialogue that the governments themselves also have, right? But that we try to facilitate together, frankly, with my friends in the industry, right? Because we find that it's to everybody's interest to have a consistent set of regulations in general. What's interesting is that there's sort of a first mover effect, if you will, meaning GDPR is a good example of this in the sense that the EU probably came out with the most strict data privacy laws first. And so basically, more or less, many other governments around the world have followed a model quite similar to GDPR after that, right? With certain tweaks, but largely it's a similar framework after that. And so in general, from Microsoft's perspective, we actually think that's good, right? Having consistency is good for multinational companies that want to operate in more than one market.
Are you hearing from many of your clients concerns, anxieties about the evolving China data regulations, not because there's anything particularly onerous about them internationally, but because there's still some ambiguity, because they are evolving, because they haven't been applied yet, because they may change? How are big businesses navigating that in China?
Yeah, my own experience, and I've been in my position now for almost 7 years, is that the Chinese government tends to create new laws and regulations that are relatively quite clear at a high level, what they intend to try to do, but that they are frankly never clear at the operating level. And so it takes a lot of collaboration, frankly, with the government regulators to figure out on an executional or operational level what that means. And I'll give you an example of this. When we landed our cloud in China 8 years ago, there was a very clear statement that said, hey, the data center must be operated by a Chinese company, okay? So we asked the Chinese regulators a question, which is, so in your data centers, you run hundreds of thousands, if not millions of servers, right? Which need to be upgraded occasionally, right? Not just the hardware, but the software on them. That's what keeps the cloud going. Who's allowed to go into the data center and upgrade them? Because the partner, our operating entity, may not have the expertise to actually do the work, but they're the ones that are, in theory, only the ones that are supposed to be able to do this. And so there's sort of a practical concern there, right? And we worked out with the Chinese government what ended up being called an escort model, which is a Microsoft employee can only enter our data centers in China if they are escorted by an employee of 21Vinet, which is the operating entity partner. And then everything that's hands-on has to be done by the 21Vinet employee. The Microsoft employee can give them instruction and guidance, but they can't touch anything. And that was deemed by the cybersecurity regulators to be compliant. And so there's a lot of, back to your fundamental question, Michael, which is around the new data laws, you're absolutely right. At a high level, I think most people understand the direction they're going, but in terms of practical implication, it's not clear, even frankly, to the Chinese government, right? What we found practically is a lot of times you have to go to the Chinese regulator and say, okay, we understand that high level, the law says this. How does it apply in this scenario? 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 And you will raise questions that they didn't really think of, right, when they were writing the law. And it's only through a lot of collaboration with the Chinese government that you can then reach an executional model that everybody feels okay with, right? Meaning the regulator thinks that complies with what we're trying to intend, right? And then you can move forward with your business. And so the somewhat tricky thing, right? I'm not a lawyer, but when I speak to customers, I always tell them, listen, we're happy to have our lawyers speak to your lawyers about this. We can talk about what the letter of the law actually says. But the truth is there's a pretty big gray area, right? And I'll give you a small example. Out of 3 very large German automotive companies who are all our customers, right, in China, there's one that's very conservative, right? They're like, we don't want any data leaving China ever. There's one that's very relatively, they asked me, they're like, okay, Microsoft, do you use software as a service globally, right, from another data center outside of China for your own employees in China? And we do. Microsoft does, right? Our lawyers have assessed it, and we conclude that that's okay. And the customer said, well, if it's good enough for you, it's good enough for me. And I said, wait. I said, no. You need to assess that risk yourself, right? Because we're first of all, we're in different industries, right? So the laws may apply slightly differently. But at any rate, that just shows you the diversity, right? And the third manufacturer, the third automotive player is sort of in the middle, right? So 3, all in the automotive industry, all German players, but 3 different interpretations based on their own legal counsel, right? And I'm like, okay, as Microsoft, we're going to do our best to serve you however you choose to do it, right?
Yeah, look, it sounds like a fertile ground for lawyers. I'm not a lawyer either. But what's the recommendation to businesses? Is it you need to engage with the authorities in China and try to come up with practical applications that work for your business to comply with the law? Is it looking at best practice across sectors? Is it a combination?
Yeah, I think that the first thing I would say is, in this regard, it helps to work within your industries together, right? Because generally speaking, you compete with one another on business and for customers, but you would prefer to have consistent regulations that everybody can understand, right? So I think that's one of the things I would say. In this sense, it helps to work together both within your industry with your competitors in this case, but also with relatively more neutral technology providers like a Microsoft, right, who are working across industries. Because then, to your point, Michael, we can share what players from various industries are doing in terms of their interpretation. And then also we can work together speaking directly to the government, right? That's one of the things we do a lot with customers.
Rowan, that's terrific. Well, thank you very much. We need to leave it there. I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. Really interesting space, this whole data in the data issue in China, and we're getting a lot from our clients about, you know, how does one navigate it. So immensely useful information. So thank you very much indeed. Let's now move to the topic of digital transformation in China and in the US and that comparison. And I'd like to invite now Sun Tianshu, Visiting Professor of Information Systems, Director of the Center for Technology, Big Data and Digital Transformations at CKGSB, to deliver his presentation. Professor Sun, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. And thanks for having me to this event. And I wonder if you can see my slides.
Yes, we can. Full screen now. Got them. Yes.
Yeah. So it's great to share this very exciting topic of digital transformation in China and the US, some observations on the digital ecosystem. In the next 8 to 10 minutes, I would like to give a very brief discussion on the contrast between China and US on digital transformation and digital ecosystem. I hope the contrast can not only help us understand the difference between China and US, like especially when entering the Chinese market, but also could unravel some general principles for the underlying forces in the digital ecosystem in China. The observations is based on my work and also research across US and China in the past 12 years. So where I have been both a professor at CKGSB in China and also a tenured professor at USC in US, and also I worked in the Facebook core data science, Alibaba, Adobe, NetEase, Groupon Living Social, and also consulted a range of startups in the US and China. And the observation is really based on like my work experience and really specifically to today's theme, the global data landscape. Last year, I was invited to write an overview with 4 Nobel laureates in economics on the data calculus in the digital era, in which we also covered some recent development in China on the data regulation. But for the interest of time, I'd just like to highlight 3 key differences between US and China on the digital transformation. Like based on the comparison, if you see if you're familiar with the digital ecosystem on both sides, you can see there seems to be like nice correspondence between the 2 ecosystems. However, I would argue that the underlying kind of dynamics and the underlying forces are quite different, especially in their growth model, in the kind of concentration and scope of data, and also in the innovation mode. So let me elaborate the first key difference. So I would like to summarize the key difference using this figure. So in like when I was working in Silicon Valley, like I worked quite a few years, it's very interesting that there is very little competition, head-to-head competition on the core interest between the tech giants there. Like if you think, like Amazon does not directly compete with Facebook, right? And Google does not directly compete with Netflix. And if you pick like any 2 in the top 10 tech firms in US, they do not directly compete head-to-head in some of the core interests. But in China, it's very interesting that there's a very strong competition between all the top giants. If you think about like ByteDance and Kuaishou, the short video platforms versus Alibaba and JD.com, they actually compete very heavily on the e-commerce, which is the core interest for Alibaba and JD. If you think about ByteDance versus Tencent, then they compete very strongly on the like gaming, on social, on entertainment. And also between like Tencent and Alibaba, for sure, they compete on like mobile payment and so on and so forth. And Didi versus Meituan, like seemingly quite different platform. They compete on the kind of ride sharing and so on and so forth. And also Meituan versus Alibaba. Meituan is like Groupon in China versus Alibaba. They compete heavily on like local service, food delivery, and so on and so forth. So it's very interesting to see this key difference, which I summarize as the horizontal versus vertical growth mode. The Chinese digital platforms are growing more in a horizontal way, right? Across sectors, right? From e-commerce to fintech to logistics to like local service and so on. But the US firms are more growth in a specialized way, like Facebook is entering the global markets, right? And it's more focused on social networking, but in like through different medium, like through Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, then like Meta, right? The VR and Oculus and so on and so forth. And also like the focus is quite different. Like the Chinese tech firms, they're more focused on domestic growth versus the US firms are very much focused on global expansion. Also like, for instance, Microsoft, Amazon Web Service, they have a lot of the growth coming from the international markets. And the implication of such a difference in growth mode is profound because it has impact on the firm scope, on the innovation mode, and also very importantly to today's discussion on the scope of the data, right? And also all the AI applications based on such data. If you think about, for instance, like Tencent, they have data across a wide range of activities of an individual consumer, like through which they can kind of build AI applications, like new algorithms to kind of provide more customer experience. Whereas Facebook, they're more focused on the they connect more data in a specific area sector. but at a broader scale across the international markets. So the question here is also, why so? Why like the Chinese tech firms are growing this way, like wider and wider, right, horizontally, whereas the US digital platforms growing in a more vertical way? My research and my observation is the following. I think it fundamentally relates to the monetization model and market size between the two countries. I was asking this question to a lot of executives in my class at CKGSB, like whether Chinese internet market is big enough. And most of them say yes, but my answer is no, right? My answer is the kind of domestic market for the Chinese tech platforms is actually very crowded, right? In general, there are 4 types of monetization model for the digital platform: advertising, content monetization, game, and e-commerce. But if you look closely at like advertising market and content monetization market, the Chinese firm actually need to compete on much smaller kind of revenue base as compared to the US, right? And on the game and e-commerce is kind of comparable in terms of total size of market, but in terms of per capita, like per user, is much less. So with this kind of limited kind of market revenue, like the Chinese platform is actually constrained by this relatively small domestic market, especially given the market value of those platforms. So they have this strong kind of pressure and to kind of either compete fiercely within the domestic market, kind of go across more and more industry sectors, right, in order to sustain their market cap, the market kind of like their stock price, or they need to explore the possibility of globalization. However, the globalization has become more and more challenging for a lot of those Chinese digital companies because of various reasons. And with this, you can see more and more like domestic competition, right? In Chinese, we also call it involution, right? 内卷. So like in this, and this is a important to keep enter this Chinese market. You might face very fierce competition in a lot of those sectors, from the incumbent in that specific sector, but also from giants, which kind of across sectors. This is the first key difference. And because of this difference in the growth mode, you may also see a key difference between the data scope or data concentration, like between the two markets. In China, the data collected by the top platforms are of have broader scope, and the data is more concentrated in a few key players in the Chinese market. But in the US, like in general, especially before the Cambridge Analytics event and before like 2020, you see a more open data ecosystem. And also the scope of their data collection is much narrower, right? Like Facebook only social, like Amazon mostly e-commerce, and also some like video streaming data on consumer, and then Google mostly on search and Android and so on and so forth. But in China, for instance, you see WeChat or like ByteDance may span a range of sectors and so on. And such data collection and data assets have fundamental implications on the development of AI. So this is like an interesting comparison by Dr. Kai-Fu Lee in his book, right, on the difference in AI development between US and China. So like, and it definitely echoes my own experience working in Silicon Valley and also working in China in the top tech firms. Like, for instance, the US firms are more research-driven, expert-driven. For instance, if you look at all the top AI models and also framework from like PyTorch, Caffe, to the recent GPT-3 model, the diffusion model, and so on and so forth, is mostly by those pioneers like Jeff Hinton, like Yan LeCun, and so on and so forth. But China has a comparative advantage in those data-driven applications, and also in those kind of, I would call it like scene-based or like scenario-based applications, right? They have very interesting, for instance, integration of data and also business models across sector. For instance, e-commerce and mobile payment, right? For instance, online shopping and offline shopping. For instance, like local service, like ride sharing, plus like grocery shopping online, right? So you see a lot of those interesting business model innovations empowered by rich data collected by the digital platform. So this leads to a very interesting difference. And also, if you think about companies like TikTok, right? They initially actually grow based on the data collected on Chinese consumers, right? And then the AI model is trained and the hyperparameters are tuned. Then like such model become full-fledged and can be kind of used like in their global expansion and so on. So this keeps the scope and concentration and also on the AI development. Now, like I want to reach the final difference, which I call it the kind of digital innovation mode, right? And I would say that the US is more based on a data-driven bottom-up innovation mode. I'm talking about private sector, and the Chinese company is more based on a strategy-driven top-down innovation mode. And let me use my own research in the area of digital experimentation as an example. While I was working at Facebook, I was amazed, fascinated by the like data-driven and culture, and also the decentralized bottom-up innovations in the company, right? There are tens of thousands like of experimentation every year by their frontline employees to experiment with different product features, algorithms, and so on and so forth. For instance, some of the most important innovations at Facebook, like Newsfeed, is not like designed by Mark Zuckerberg, but actually like discovered by the frontline engineers and the product managers, right? Whereas in China, you see more of those strategy-driven top-down innovations, right? As I mentioned, like for instance, WeChat, for instance, Taobao and on financial, they have a lot of those very interesting business model innovation, business model experimentation empowered by the kind of data and also the top-down design. And also from a policy perspective, you see the Chinese government have a lot of those policy experiments in both in the private sector and also in their regulation. And the interesting thing is how to combine both, right? How to combine the strength of both when you enter the China, and also when you kind of adapt your kind of both data strategy and also digital competition strategy in this new market. So I would stop here for the interest of time, but I want to summarize the three key differences between US and China on the digital transformation. And like, for instance, the first one is the horizontal versus vertical growth in their digital platform ecosystem. The second one is data-driven versus data-driven bottom-up versus strategy-driven top-down in the digital innovation mode. And final one is the data and AI ecosystem, which is expert-driven versus the application or data-driven. But I would just want to say a few sentences on another very important difference, which I don't have time to cover today, but I have spent a lot of efforts exploring the enterprise technology ecosystem in US and China. In US, like the ecosystem is based on Amazon Web Service, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. In China, it's based on Alibaba Cloud, Tencent Cloud, and Huawei Cloud. And but it's very different. And I'll just highlight two set of keywords: private versus public, closed versus open. Like in China, most of the enterprise software as a service, SaaS, PaaS, IaaS, are deployed now in the form of a private cloud, right? And especially for state-owned enterprise, for the government, and also for a lot of the traditional enterprise. And this leads to fundamental difference in the marginal cost and also in the kind of scalability of the cloud-based technology and ecosystem. Because for the US ecosystem, the public cloud allows both the cloud companies and also the PaaS and SaaS companies on top of those cloud companies to easily deploy their software at a very low marginal cost, and they can quickly scale and updates and enhance like their R&D to this ecosystem. But in China, in like the deployment, the process and the economics of scale is very different, and which can explain a lot of differences we see in the in the kind of startup ecosystem, right? In US, you see hundreds of unicorns in the area of enterprise technology, and also many established one in a tier structure like Amazon Web Service, which is 1,000 billion company. On top of that, you have quite a few 100 billion companies like Salesforce, Databricks, Snowflake, Adobe, and so on and so forth. Then on top of it, you have many 10 billion companies, then unicorns. But in China, you have a few tech giants, right, cloud company, but then a very large number of outsourcing company, deployment company, and so on and so forth. So I won't have the time to dive into this detail, but I think it's a lot of much related to these private versus public cloud, and also closed versus open ecosystem. Like in China, in short, you kind of deploy the enterprise service and software by people, right? But in US, a lot of those deployment of software and service is based on API, based on the open ecosystem. And that leads to a fundamental difference when you want to enter the market. Up here, yeah, Michael, I turn the
Professor
back to
Sun,
you.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you very, very much. And as I said, extraordinary research, and you made very clear some of the key differences you see, and that I expect poses challenges. It also presents some opportunities for businesses trying to operate in those jurisdictions. So Professor Sun, thank you very much indeed. Let's move now on to our panel discussion, and a reminder that we're really keen to have your involvement today. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please let me know on the chat function, or put your hand in the air and I'll bring you in as best I can. It's my great pleasure to welcome our speakers today. Anthony Butler, Chief Technology Officer, IBM, who's joining us from Riyadh. Violet Chung, Partner, McKinsey & Company, who joins us from Hong Kong. And Ni Yang, Associate Professor of Marketing, CKGSB, who is in Beijing. All of you, welcome, and thank you very, very much indeed for joining us. Violet, if I may start with you, just broadly speaking, what trends are you seeing in the fintech space? Because we've touched on it, but not gone very deeply into fintech, the fintech space in China.
Yes, so I would say in the past decade or so, we've really seen sort of an entrance of especially the tech natives, and some of which Professor Sun just spoke about, have started to enter essentially into the financial space, right? And I think this is most prevalent, I think, in the past 7 to 8 years, where you start to see a wave of payments, the ease of this, and really overtaking, some of the consumer behaviors, right? For example, back in 2014, people will be carrying with a stack of cash. I don't even carry cash anymore when I'm in mainland, right? But the fundamental change shifts on that is quite phenomenal. I think payment took the first wave. Then in the last wave or so, you started to see this trickle into other verticals within financial space, which include, wealth management. So the payment for a lot of folks who have essentially payment accounts on Ant or on Tenpay, which is under the Tencent system, you tend to buy sort of money market funds, mutual funds, so on and so forth on that, right? Then I think in the past 3 to 4 years or so, it started to trickle into lending, right? Which, many of which our earlier speakers have spoken about how, many of these tech giants have been leveraging some of the social behaviors, some of the locational data, some of the other alternative unstructured data to start underwriting, right, for consumer lending, right, including on the SME side, especially on the micro side. So it's a phenomenal trend where, I think 10 years ago, one would say that, markets like US or elsewhere are actually leading some of the innovation on fintech. Whereas in the past few years, especially in the most recent sort of 7 or 8 years or so, you're starting to see a lot of innovation undertaking, and many of which are actually led by these tech who may not necessarily be the financial natives. I would say with the macro changes and also some regulatory changes, that pressure is starting to get to essentially some of the incumbents, right? And you're starting to see essentially incumbents taking a lot more initiatives to both partner with many of these fintechs, and secondly, also investing quite significantly in their own sort of data analytics capability, right? Some of which involves talent, some of which involves the large transformation, some of which involves rebuilding architecture and, just really the way of working, right? So I would say sort of in the past decade or so, that phenomenal change has really shifted the industry in a very meaningful way.
Thank you. Leanne, can I come to you now? Violet mentioned data analytics, and what are you seeing in businesses? How are they balancing data analytics and complying with data governance laws, and how are they making those regulations work to enable their businesses?
Wow, that's a very broad question. Well, because I'm in marketing, okay. So let me take like say ByteDance for example, right? So ByteDance definitely every day they are doing tons of data analytics, okay. But at the same time, they are also a content platform. As you know, content platform in China is under quite a strict, regulation and a lot of attention. So of course they need to design their algorithms. They need to design their analytics process to be consistent with all these regulations, short term and long term. Okay, and in the end they need to make money, the advertising revenue, and so that's why I think this is related to what Professor Sun Tiansu just mentioned, because they see this type of a limitation. It's not like in other markets that you have actually a lot of rooms and potential to grow just for one direction. So they have to diversify. They have to go to other directions. For example, now ByteDance, TikTok, they are very much focused on developing their e-commerce business. They are good. They're bringing they're bringing a competition directly with Alibaba, with the JD. Okay, they're entering the war with Alibaba, with the JD during the November 11th, the Singles Day shopping festival, etc., etc. Yeah, so I think this is a super broad question. So, yeah, if I can talk a specific example, I want to talk about ByteDance. I think I think ByteDance is a good example. Yes, yeah.
Okay, Anthony Buff, I want to come to you now. IBM works across many geographies. You're in the Middle East. You work in the Middle East and Africa. We've spoken a lot today about different data regulation regimes and the challenges that pose. What are you seeing? How's IBM and its clients trying to navigate the different regulations, and especially as you're based in the Middle East, where regulations are coming on stream at a pace in a market that's trying to develop a fintech sector in particular?
So I think, what we're seeing globally is that data has emerged as sort of the fifth factor of production. If you think of land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, data is increasingly becoming a source of new economic value. And I think China has really led the way, both in capturing the data and also how that data can be transformed into value. And in fact, cross-border data flows accounts for a larger share of GDP than trade in manufactured goods. So we see data as being at the heart of all of this. And, as we spoke about, harmonization of regulations and some of the challenges particularly when it comes to cross-border data flows. If I look at the region that I'm responsible for, Middle East and Africa, you have an extreme diversity of approaches to data and how cross-data flows in particular are being regulated. I think that the types of value that can be created by allowing the free flow of data are significant. So I think about productivity improvements. So for entrepreneurs in countries that might not have access to a global market, being able to leverage hyperscaler cloud capabilities, being able to move data offshore for processing is allowing them to develop new business models. It's lowering the cost of market entry and distribution. We're also seeing that the ability to deploy data anywhere in the world can improve resilience. We're seeing new forms of relationship between employer and employee being formed, the emergence of digital labor markets that allow someone in a village in a country in Africa to provide their own personal labor-based services to an entrepreneur somewhere else in the world, or an established firm somewhere else in the world. And all of this is obviously involving the movement of data cross-border. And then when I think about innovation, and the first speaker from Microsoft was talking about the innovations that are delivered through the cloud, I think being able to access hyperscaler cloud capabilities lowers the marginal cost of innovation, because you're able to get access to very, very advanced compute and AI and other capabilities that would otherwise not be attainable if you were to limit yourself to what was available within your country. So I think, you know, this is emerged as one of the major topics of discussion, particularly what we've been seeing in the world with these discussions around deglobalization and localization of supply chains. Some of that is also spilling over into discussions around the movement of data and digital services, which I think is a challenge. And to your point around regulations, I think the answer is not to have unified regulations across the world. I think it should be principle based, where rather than try and have, you know, one set of data rules that governs the entire planet or a part of the planet, there should be bilateral or multilateral agreement on certain principles, and, you know, using international standards, schemes, protocols, a kind of shared language, as opposed to having, you know, a hard harmonization of legislation. And you know, one of the interesting things that we've also been involved in and following is these digital free trade agreements, which again is trying to unlock some of the economic value that I mentioned through the facilitation of cross-border movement of data. So I think this is certainly becoming one of the major points of discussion that we're having with clients in the region, particularly in countries that don't have access to the hyperscaler cloud capabilities, where they are reliant on cross-border data flows.
Yeah, Anthony, thanks very much. I want to bring in the audience now. The first question from Alan Chu of Radical. Alan, are you with us?
Yeah.
Please, your question.
Michael, thank you for putting this event together. Wonderful. So to the panelists, I just want to ask, now, you know, what Anthony just described, is that the type of digitization détente that we're sort of heading towards? Do you see, do all the speakers see that we're going to be able to sort of work together on the future of the planet, whether through COP27 or anything that we have in common, decarbonization? You know, I mean, digitization is a part of that solution to sustainability. So if that's the case, is there a point where we're going to come together and sort of work together and have a more peaceful and wonderful world?
Violet, an easy question for you. I'll start with you, Violet. I like the term digital détente. Is there any prospect of digital détente? It seems at the moment, from our position, that data regulations are going in very different directions, very complex, very hard to read for any organization working globally. So Violet, question to you: a digital détente, is that on the cards?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing is essentially the following, right? I mean, it's a given that essentially digital analytics is taking a large part of many organizations' top priority, right? For the financial institutions that I'm looking at, essentially, you know, we ask the CEOs and CTOs of organization, how much would you be spending in the next 3 years on this, right? I think this essentially becomes the top 1 or 2 priorities for the majority of institutions. And, you know, over 70% says that, you know, over the next 3 years, they'll be spending over $100 million USD, right, on both the I guess the software and also the hardware, right? So that's I think is an established fact. The second thing on essentially how you know, especially multinationals and cross-border organizations are thinking about this, right? The reality is, as Anthony mentioned, each of the market is looking at their own principle alignment on what makes sense and what they would hire to, right? So I think a few things that one cannot avoid is that there essentially needs a combination of how one thinks about global centric for certain function and having localized functions, right? Some of these pillars include, how do you think about the front end user experiences, right? A lot of that probably needs to be quite localized. Hence, how you think about your talent structure, right? How you think about your ecosystem of who you work with matters, right? The other pillar is around sort of back-end systems, right? So on that, that very much has to do with, some of the data regulation, also the cross-border regulations of each localized market, right? So you probably would need to have some form of localized tech system, right, that actually helps to enable the front-end experiences. The third is around the hardcore data, right? Where do you store it, right? And regulation by regulation are different across different markets, right? But that I think requires a bit of a combination of how one thinks about it. Infrastructure as well, right? I think in one of the earlier speakers spoke about sort of infrastructure in the past. Especially for multinationals, they like to do a bit of a plug and play from global capability, right? How much of that actually remains true? What one has to debate depends on the market. The last two is around sort of operating model and also the team capabilities, right? I think very much of that probably requires a bit of a localization, but not necessarily localization by market. It could be by region. Right. So I know that doesn't straightly answer your question, but I think you asked a big question that requires a bit of
and it is. And it's one that businesses and governments, frankly, are grappling with on a daily basis. It's a huge one. Li Yang, to you, I know you come from a marketing perspective, but how important is it for an organization trying to market, trying to reach consumers, trying to build a consumer base, that there is some sort of harmonization or an agreed approach to the treatment of data?
Okay. So I think we have been talking a lot about data compliance, GDPR, cross-border regulation, etc. Yeah. So I think ideally we want to have something like a plug and play, right? So companies with the customer database, they can use similar tools, they can use similar approaches to organize the data, to do all these fancy things in marketing, targeting, etc. But unfortunately, I don't see this. I see this general trend, but I don't see this like quickly happening in China. In the sense, I want to make two comments. The first one is the walled gardens. Okay, so we talk about all these country differences, legal differences. But actually, there are huge company differences, right?
Good point.
So
yes.
I use this system, then I cannot use that system, right? They have different APIs, they have different interface, they have different way of work. So I think this happens a lot in China. Okay, so I think companies needs to take a side. Okay, pick the option they are most comfortable with. And as Professor Shun Dianshu mentioned, actually in China, many companies in China, they prefer private cloud rather than public cloud. I think that's just one example of reflection of all this happening. And the second comment I want to make is data is not for many businesses. Okay, for consumer business, for particular, data is not everything. Okay. A company has its own business, right? An auto company is selling cars. Okay, first they need to produce good cars, and the consumers like the cars. Then they can accumulate data. Then they can build up their strategies on data. But what happens if their cars are not competitive anymore? So I think it's an easy thing to blame the data regulation, to blame these different systems. But actually, sometimes I think it's more of the problem is about the core business, not just about the data, right? So for example, nowadays the auto industry in China, they are not doing very well. maybe because of the overall economy, and also because of the competition from the Tesla, from Neo, et cetera, right? So I think for them the primary thing is not just the data, right? It's a market competition. It's about the product. It's about making the customer happy. So that's the two comments I want to make.
No, that's a very good point. I mean, you can have all the data in the world, but if your car breaks down,
yeah. So
I would have thought. Anthony, quick comment, because you raised this, quick comment from you on the digital détente prospects.
Look, I think that there are certain global challenges that will force us to solve this problem. Some of the prior speakers were talking about the challenges around sustainability. So in order for us to address the global challenges that we have around carbon emissions, like, for example, Scope 3 reporting, that by definition will require us to move data across borders and start to work together to share. I think what will happen is that there will be something of a hybrid model. So it won't be, everything delivered from outside of a country. It will not be everything deployed within the country, but there will be a balance, right? Because recognizing that a lot of the discussions around localization is driven by topics of resiliency. So how can we as a nation have digital sovereignty? How can we be more resilient? Now, resiliency comes from having things within your country, but it also comes from having a more diversified supply chain. So I think we'll start to see the same nuances feed into the discussions around digitization. So I am hopeful that we will reach this digital détente state.
Great, thank you. Next question now from Will Cavendish of Arab. Will, hi, your question, please.
Hi, and thanks, Michael, for hosting this into the panel. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah,
brilliant.
absolutely. Please go ahead. Loud and clear.
So I wanted to pick up a little bit that sort of question of data standards, because data regulations and data rules and residency is one thing, but actually as we know, if data is a fifth factor of production, there's a whole range of things around common standards, ontologies, object recognitions, and so on, that make all of that work really well. Anthony, you said you think that'll happen because the world needs it. I guess equally, there's a view or a perception that the Chinese government in particular is becoming much more active in international forums in trying to define those standards as international norms, and that maybe we're heading to a new era of sort of data anti-diplomacy or non-détente around this. And that's going to have a profound impact on the ability of data to flow or otherwise. And I just really wanted the panel's views on how they see that sort of playing out. Are we expecting a new area of kind of competition in that area between the US and China in terms of who controls data standards? Or do you see a more mixed model emerging? Because that's going to be really fundamental to international businesses' ability to operate smoothly and to get the greatest benefits from potential new data world.
Thank you. Great question. I'm going to ask each of you. Anthony, I'll start with you.
So yeah, I think there's always been, even the private sector there's always been an impetus to try and own and dominate and influence standards, right? Because if you can influence the standard, that gives you some advantage when it comes to the products that you build that comply with that standard. But I think, the fact that a standard is originating in China or any other country isn't in itself a good or a bad thing. What's important is that the standard, it involves a degree of openness. So if in software world, open source, open standards, having an open ecosystem that can come together, represent the views of their respective nation or their respective industry and guide the standards, similar to how things like Linux and others have evolved. I think that's important. It shouldn't be necessarily one nation pushing a standard on the world, because that will have issues with adoption as well.
Professor Lee, your view. I mean, China is trying to take a lead here. We see that, and we hear, them speaking at major global forums.
Yes, yeah. We do see that. Yeah, and also I want to relate this to my previous comment. I think very often data is a consequence. It's not just the course. It's not just the driver. So I think for China or for any other country to push their own standards, it depends on the success of their own companies. Okay, so for example, say Didi has its own data standards for transportation, and Uber also has its own standards. Then who will win depends on their own business. And also relate to Anthony's points, how open is the market, or how close, how much is the barrier? Okay, apparently Uber now is not competing in China anymore. So Uber's whatever standards they use, they are not in China. Okay, so China in this huge transportation market, so Didi has its standards. Yeah. So I think yeah, it's easy to have to design a standard, but it's very hard for the market, for the people to accept it. So in the end, I think it depends on how successful the companies, okay, the major companies, how successful they are in the market. Yeah.
Okay. Violet, your view, is this a case of the companies that are most successful and the regimes that work for those companies are more likely to be adopted, or is this China and the US competing on the international stage again, another area of tension between the two?
I would actually take a different spin to the question, right? I think whoever owns essentially the data center is less interesting, at least for the clients I serve, right?
Yeah.
And I do serve quite a few across the region. I think the more interesting problem is, and all companies actually, regardless of which country and which vertical they are in, are facing the same thing, right? You tend to see sort of a few common issues, right? And one is, essentially, for lack of better words, the architecture for data and the infrastructure around that is not necessary in the state of art, right? So you see sort of data spread across hundreds of source systems, and that's a very common issue for many organizations. You also see sort of thousands of point-to-point data flow without sort of a well-structured architecture. Right, you see a lot of siloed data aggregation and consumption across departments, right? And again, this is regardless of which standard of data form that we're talking about. You also see sort of not necessarily clear roles and responsibility on data management across the organization, right? These are type of questions I think it's more meaningful as organizations think about the applications of these, right?
So these are internal company issues about the architecture they have for treating their data, the way they manage their data. And so in a practical sense, you're seeing from your clients, they're the issues that they're grappling with more than who at the geopolitical level is going to take the lead in the taxonomy debate.
Exactly.
It's interesting, really interesting.
Exactly.
Thank you. We've got time for another question. Let's go to Jeffrey Tan of YCH. Jeffrey, hi, good to see you.
Hi, good to see everybody. Yeah. Probably I'll just cut it short with the question since we are running short of time also. So I guess from the government to government level in terms of the establishing the data part in terms of trust between government, I see that in Singapore, we have been actively establishing what we call the Digital Economy Agreement, DEA, with different countries like Australia and UK. So for the sake of the discussion between China and the rest of the other countries, including US, with such DEA helps in terms of the effectiveness for the entire global digital transformation, and also facilitate international businesses to actually interoperate digitally. And if we extend it a bit further, if you look at an entirely interoperable data management framework, which like in ASEAN has already launched the ASEAN Data Management Framework, does that really help in terms of managing this data across border and the entire digital transformation that's going to take place and globally and regionally? Yeah.
Great, Anthony, can I put that one to you first?
Sure. So I think you're referring to like the APEC cross-border privacy rules. So I think these types of agreements definitely help, right? Because they facilitate cross-border movement of data. They address all of the major issues that need to be addressed. So I think these are definitely the types of agreements that need to be put in place to facilitate us moving forward.
Well, I mean, Jeffrey talked about the Singapore agreement, and we know we've talked about the digital agreement between the UK and Singapore over here quite a bit. Are they sort of part of the solution, and do businesses get behind those? Are they seeing benefits of that sort of an agreement?
They vary in characteristics, right? So some of them are extremely prescriptive, some of them are more principle based. So the Asia Pacific example is one of the great examples, which is really laying out principles and a set of sort of high-level rules. I think this is certainly the right model, and it's the type of thing that businesses are indeed getting behind.
Violet, is that what you're seeing? The businesses are getting behind these bilateral or multilateral agreements on digital trade?
Yes, I pretty much agree with what Anthony said. Nothing else to add.
Okay, and Professor Lee.
Yeah, I mean, for the APAC region, right? We do see a lot of Chinese companies, and they are now going to Malaysia, Indonesia to do to explore these local markets. Yeah, so I do think they will very much rely on those agreements to further expand their business, influence there. Yeah.
Tremendous. Look, thank you all very much. I'm afraid we are out of time. I'd like to thank firstly our panelists, Anthony Butler, Violet Chung, and Professor Lee. Thank you very much for contributions. Thanks to you who asked questions. Very great to have your involvement. I'd like to thank our speakers from earlier in the day, a really insightful discussion. And my thanks to CKGSB, our partners in this event. It's always a pleasure working with you. These are huge issues here, the whole data piece, the data regulation, the interoperability challenges, issues for governments, they're issues for businesses, and they're ones that we follow very, very closely. So much more to come on this as regulations unfold, as the application of those regulations become clearer, and as companies try to navigate what's an increasingly complex world. So thank you all very much. Do stay safe, do stay well, and we hope to see you all very, very soon. Goodbye.